Something interesting starts happening to your body around the time most people are reaching for their first meal of the day. Before a single bite of breakfast, before the coffee fully kicks in, before you have even made a decision about what to eat, your hormones are already shifting, your fuel sources are quietly reorganizing, and the signals your body sends about hunger are doing something that most people never think to pay attention to. And if you are someone who skips breakfast intentionally or eats nothing until noon, that whole process does not just start, it compounds. The biology of a morning fast is not simply the absence of eating. It is a specific, layered sequence of metabolic events that most people are running through every single day without realizing it. Here is where it begins. When you finish your last meal at night and fall asleep, your body enters a natural fasting state. That part most people know. What fewer people think about is what happens in the hours after you wake up, when the overnight fast simply continues into the morning. Insulin, the hormone your body releases in response to carbohydrates and to a lesser extent protein, stays low. Not crashing, not dangerously low, just quiet. And that quietness matters more than it might seem. Insulin's job, among other things, is to signal your cells to take up glucose and to tell your fat tissue to hold on to what it is storing. When insulin is low, that signal loosens. The door that has been locked starts to open slightly. Your body begins to sense that it needs to find fuel from somewhere other than the meal you are no longer digesting, so it starts working through what is left. The first place it turns is glycogen, the stored form of glucose packed away in your liver and muscles from yesterday's carbohydrates. During the overnight fast, you have already been drawing from that supply. By morning, if you ate a normal amount the night before, your liver glycogen is not depleted, but it is meaningfully lower than it was at dinner time. As the morning continues without food, your body keeps pulling from that reserve. Blood sugar does not crash dramatically. In most people, the liver is doing its job, slowly releasing glucose to keep levels in a stable range. But the trajectory is different than it would be if you had eaten. Instead of glucose coming in from outside and insulin rising to meet it, the system is quietly managing its own supply, running on what it stored rather than what it just received. This is also when the body begins shifting more meaningfully toward fat as a fuel source. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and measurably. Fat cells, which had been largely in a holding pattern while insulin was elevated from yesterday's meals, start releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream. Those fatty acids travel to your muscles and organs and begin getting burned for energy. For some people, this transition feels like nothing at all. For others, especially early in the process of adapting to morning fasts, it feels like a kind of low-grade fog or sluggishness, the body's way of adjusting to a different fuel mix than it is used to running on. Hunger during this period is not a straight line upward. That is one of the more surprising things about extending a morning fast. Ghrelin, the hormone most closely associated with hunger signals, tends to rise in anticipation of meals you usually eat. If you have been eating breakfast at 7 in the morning for years, your body has learned to expect that, and it will send a ghrelin spike right around that time to make sure you follow through. But ghrelin is also remarkably adaptive. When you consistently skip or delay a meal, that anticipatory spike tends to flatten and shift over time. Many people who fast until noon report that their sharpest hunger wave hits somewhere in the late morning and then, if they wait through it, subsides before noon rather than escalating. That wave was not a warning that something was going wrong. It was a scheduled signal looking for a habit that no longer existed. By late morning, in someone who ate their last meal the evening before, mild ketone production may begin. This is worth pausing on because the word ketones tends to conjure images of extreme low-carb diets or prolonged starvation. But the liver begins converting fatty acids into ketones at relatively modest levels well before any of that. It is not a crisis signal. It is the body being practical, producing a fuel source that the brain can actually use when glucose availability is lower than usual. For most people fasting until noon, ketone levels never get dramatically high. But even a modest rise can have noticeable effects, which connects directly to something a lot of people report when they skip breakfast. Mental clarity is the thing that comes up constantly. Some people describe the late morning hours of a fast as the sharpest, most focused part of their day. Others feel the opposite, sluggish and distracted until they eat. Both experiences are real, and the difference likely comes down to a combination of factors including how metabolically flexible someone is, how long they have been fasting this way, what their stress hormones are doing, how well they slept, and how hydrated they are. Cortisol, which naturally peaks in the early morning hours, plays a role here too. It helps mobilize fuel and sharpen attention, and in some people that cortisol pulse works with the fasted state to produce a period of elevated focus. In others, especially people under chronic stress or running on insufficient sleep, that same cortisol just feels like anxiety. What your body is doing all morning, in other words, is not nothing. It is a coordinated metabolic response to the absence of incoming fuel, running through a sequence of adaptations that shifts hormone levels, fuel sourcing, and appetite signaling in ways that are measurable and meaningful. Whether those shifts work in your favor or against you, whether the late morning fast feels like clarity or exhaustion, depends on context. And that context is exactly what shapes the trade-offs worth understanding before you decide whether eating nothing until noon is something your body will actually benefit from. So knowing what the body is actually doing during those morning hours, the real question becomes whether running that whole process every day is genuinely useful or whether it is one of those things that sounds compelling in theory and falls apart in practice. The answer, depending on who you are and how you eat the rest of the day, is honestly both. Start with what the research and real-world experience consistently support. One of the most straightforward benefits of eating nothing until noon is that it compresses your eating window, and for many people that compression naturally reduces how much they eat overall. Not because fasting is magic, but because there are simply fewer hours to eat in. If you are someone who tends to graze in the evenings, snack after dinner, or eat out of boredom rather than hunger, cutting off the morning end of that window can meaningfully cut total calorie intake without requiring you to count anything or think very hard. That simplicity is real, and for some people it is the only dietary change that has ever actually stuck. There is also a reasonably consistent signal in the research around insulin sensitivity. When the body spends more hours each day with insulin low rather than cycling repeatedly through spikes and returns, some people see improvements in how their cells respond to insulin over time. This matters more for some bodies than others, and it matters more when the rest of the diet supports it. Fasting until noon while eating 2 large meals full of refined carbohydrates is not the same as fasting until noon and eating in a way that keeps blood sugar relatively stable. The window alone does not create the benefit. It creates conditions where the benefit becomes possible. The eating routine itself is something people underestimate. Having a clear, simple rule, no food before noon, removes a lot of daily decision-making. You do not have to think about what to eat for breakfast, whether to stop for something on the way to work, or whether that mid-morning snack is actually hunger or just habit. For people who find food decisions stressful or who tend to make worse choices when they are rushed in the morning, that structure can reduce the cognitive load around eating in a way that makes everything that follows a little easier. Now for the downsides, and they are worth taking seriously. The most common one is compensation. Many people who fast through the morning arrive at noon significantly hungrier than they would have been if they had eaten a modest breakfast, and they eat more than they otherwise would. If that compensation erases the calorie reduction the window was supposed to create, the whole strategy stops making sense for that person. Hunger is not the only version of this. Some people report irritability, difficulty concentrating, or a low-grade headache that does not resolve by noon. Those are not signs of detoxification or the body purging something. They are often signs of stress hormone dysregulation, low blood sugar dips that the liver is not managing as smoothly as it does in others, or simply inadequate hydration. Exercise timing gets complicated in a meaningful way. If you train in the morning while fasted, you are working out on depleted glycogen stores, and for moderate cardio or light strength work that can be completely fine, even preferred by some people. But for high-intensity training, heavy lifting, or sessions that require sustained output, morning fasted workouts can compromise performance and, over time, potentially muscle maintenance. Muscle protein synthesis responds to protein intake, and if you are compressing all of your protein into a noon to 8 window rather than distributing it across more of the day, your muscles may not have the consistent amino acid availability they would have had otherwise. If strength and muscle mass are priorities for you, that protein distribution question is not a minor detail. It is something worth thinking through carefully and potentially adjusting with a higher protein intake concentrated in the eating window. This is also the point where it is worth being clear about something that gets lost in enthusiasm for any particular eating approach. Fasting until noon does not override the fundamentals. Total diet quality, how well you sleep, how much chronic stress you are carrying, how active you are throughout the day, and whether the eating window leads you toward better or worse habits overall, are all doing more work than the timing itself. The window is a structure. What you build inside it still matters enormously. Someone sleeping 5 hours a night under significant work stress and eating heavily processed food between noon and 8 is not going to see meaningful benefits from skipping breakfast. The context has to support the strategy. There are also specific groups of people for whom fasting until noon is not a casual experiment to try without guidance. If you have diabetes and take insulin or other blood sugar medications, changing your eating window without adjusting your medication timing can create serious problems. The medication is calibrated around an eating pattern, and disrupting that pattern without medical supervision can lead to hypoglycemia that is genuinely dangerous. If you are pregnant or breastfeeding, your energy and nutrient needs are elevated and consistent, and skipping the morning hours is not a decision to make based on general interest in metabolic flexibility. And if you have any history of disordered eating, whether that is restriction, binge-restrict cycling, or an anxious relationship with food rules, a strategy built entirely around not eating until a specific time can be a framework that makes those patterns worse, not better. The structure that feels clarifying to one person can feel like permission to restrict to another. And those are not the same experience, even if they look identical from the outside. None of this means fasting until noon is a bad idea across the board. For people who are generally healthy, not on medication affected by meal timing, not training intensively in the mornings, and who find that the compressed window leads them to eat more thoughtfully rather than less, it can genuinely work well. The body is capable of running a morning fast without any crisis, and for many people the hormonal and metabolic shifts it produces land in a place that feels better than eating earlier did. But if there is a single thing worth holding on to, it is this. The body does not reward timing in isolation. It rewards patterns that fit the actual life inside them. Fasting until noon can be one of those patterns for the right person, in the right context, done with enough attention to what is actually happening. Start there and then pay close attention to what your own body tells you, because no schedule overrides that signal.